My brother-in-law's truck was parked in my mother's driveway. I sat in my car for a moment and just stared at it. That white pickup with the cracked side mirror. I knew that truck. I'd been hoping I was wrong about why it was there. I wasn't wrong. Let me back up, because none of this will make sense unless you understand who my mother is and what the past 3 years looked like for our family. My mother turned 68 last spring. She spent 31 years as an educational assistant in the same elementary school in Barrie, Ontario. She retired 2 years ago with a modest pension, a bad knee from decades of crouching down to kids' level, and absolutely zero savings beyond her RRSP, which she'd had to dip into twice when things got tight. My father passed away 7 years ago from a cardiac event. He was 59. He never got to retire. That's something my mother has never really stopped grieving, even when she smiles, especially when she smiles. After my father died, she stayed in the house they'd shared for 24 years, a small 2-story on a quiet street in Barrie. Older house, drafty winters, a backyard with a lilac bush my father planted the year I was born. She said she couldn't leave it. I understood that, but the house needed work she couldn't afford. The furnace was original to the house. The roof had been patched twice. The bathroom on the main floor had water damage behind the tiles that she just kept painting over because the alternative was a bill she couldn't face. I'm a civil engineer. I've been working in infrastructure consulting in Ottawa for 8 years. I'm not wealthy, but I'm stable in a way my mother never had the chance to be. And I've been aware of that gap my entire adult life. So 3 years ago, quietly, I started a plan. I didn't tell her. I didn't tell my sister either. I want to be careful about how I talk about my sister, because she is not a villain in the way that makes things simple. She's 3 years older than me. She lives about 40 minutes from my mother in Innisfil, and she loves our mother in her own way. I believe that. But she has always operated from a place of scarcity, even when the scarcity wasn't real. She married her husband about 9 years ago. He works in sales, keeps track of every dollar that moves through any room he's in, and has a way of making generosity feel like a transaction you haven't finished paying yet. I'd watched him, over the years, slowly become the person who spoke for my sister in family conversations. She'd say something and then glance at him. That glance told me everything. What I built for my mother took 2.5 years and cost me $287,000. I want to say that number out loud because people sometimes assume it means something about status or performance. It doesn't. It was just the number. The house she was in needed more work than it was worth, and I had a choice between patching something broken or building something that would hold. I chose the second thing. I bought a piece of property 45 minutes north of Barrie, near a small lake in a community my mother had mentioned once, years ago. When we drove through it on a road trip, she'd said, completely offhand, that it looked like the kind of place where you could actually hear yourself think. I remembered that. I held on to it. I worked with a builder I trusted. Modest footprint, single story so her knee wouldn't be an issue, radiant floor heating, a covered porch that faced the water, a garden bed along the south side of the property that I left unplanted on purpose so she could decide what went there. I handled all of it remotely, flew up 3 times during construction, paid for everything through a combination of savings, a personal line of credit, and a private mortgage I took out against a property I own in Ottawa. I set up automatic property tax payments for the next 12 years through a trust account. I put the property in my mother's name. That was a deliberate choice, and I'll explain why in a moment, because it matters to the rest of this story. The plan was to bring her up for what I told her was a birthday weekend. Just the 2 of us, a drive north, some time by the water. She asked if my sister was coming. I said not this time. She didn't push it, but I could hear a small hesitation in her voice that I told myself I'd address later. I should have addressed it sooner. We drove up on a Saturday morning in late September. The leaves were turning. She had her travel mug, and she was talking about a podcast she'd been listening to about the history of the Hudson's Bay Company, and it felt completely normal, which is what I had wanted. Normal and then extraordinary. That was the plan. We turned onto the private road that leads to the property. The lake was visible through the trees. The house sat back from the water just enough that the whole thing came into view at once, rather than in pieces. And that is when I saw the truck. My brother-in-law's white pickup with the cracked side mirror was parked in the driveway of a house that had been finished for 11 days. My mother went very quiet beside me. I pulled up slowly. I could see lights on inside. I could see movement through the front window. I put the car in park, and I sat there for a moment doing the thing I always do in high-pressure situations, which is take inventory. What do I know? What do I not know yet? What do I have with me? I had my bag in the back seat, and in my bag was a folder. I'll come back to that. We walked to the front door and I opened it. It was my property and I had the key, and there was my sister sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of tea and her laptop open, and there was her husband standing at the window that faced the water with his arms crossed, already positioned like a person who is about to tell you something. My mother said her name, just her name, quietly. The way you say a name when you are confused and a little frightened and trying very hard not to show it. My sister stood up and said she could explain. Her husband turned from the window and said there was nothing to explain, actually, that this was quite straightforward. He said that he and my sister had been doing some research. He said that when a property is gifted to a parent by a child in Ontario, it becomes part of the family estate. He said that the family estate belongs to all the children equally. He said that he and my sister had already been in contact with someone who could help them understand their options. I looked at my sister. She was looking at the table. He kept talking. He said that, of course, no one was disputing my generosity. He said the gesture was lovely. He said the word lovely the way some people say the word cute, which is to say, as a diminishment. He said that the practical reality was that this asset needed to be accounted for fairly across the family, and that he had already spoken with a property management contact who thought the location was quite marketable for short-term rentals, possibly bringing in $3,000 to $4,000 a month in peak season, and that income should naturally flow to both daughters equally, since the property would one day form part of both their inheritances. My mother was standing in the kitchen of a house she had never seen before, in a place she had told me once that she'd like to live, and her hands were shaking around the straps of her handbag. I watched her hands. I didn't say anything yet. He finished. He looked at me the way people look at you when they believe they have already won. I asked my mother to sit down. She sat down. I pulled out the chair across from my sister, sat down too, and put my bag on the table. My sister finally looked up at me. She had the expression of someone who has been talked into something and has spent the past hour regretting it, but has gone too far to say so. I said her name. I told her I loved her. I meant it. I said I wanted her to listen to what I was about to say, and I wanted her to actually hear it, not just wait for it to be over. Then I opened the folder. The first document was the title registration for the property. My mother's name was on it, as sole owner. Beside it was a notation I'd had added by my solicitor, a life estate designation, meaning the property was structured so that my mother held it for the duration of her life, and upon her death, it would pass according to a separate instrument, not according to the general rules of estate distribution. The second document was that separate instrument, a deed of gift with a reversionary clause, prepared and registered with the assistance of a real estate lawyer in Barrie. It specified that in the event of my mother's death, the property would transfer to me, not into general estate assets. The third document was a letter from that same lawyer outlining, in plain language, that the property had been structured specifically to ensure it could not be claimed, rented, leveraged, or otherwise encumbered by any party other than the named life tenant, my mother, without her sole and unambiguous written consent. There was a section that addressed short-term rental platforms specifically. My lawyer had anticipated that possibility. I had asked her to. The fourth document was a trust account statement showing 12 years of property tax payments, already funded and scheduled. My brother-in-law's expression did not change all at once. It changed the way ice changes in early spring. First, a stillness, then something underneath it shifting, then a slow, surface-level fracture. He said that he would need to speak with his own lawyer. I said that was completely his right, and I'd be happy to provide my lawyer's contact information so they could speak directly. He said the reversionary clause might not hold up. I said my lawyer had been practicing real estate law in Ontario for 22 years and was confident in the instrument, but again, he was welcome to seek a second opinion. He said this wasn't what he'd expected. I said I imagined it wasn't. My sister hadn't spoken. She was looking at our mother. My mother was looking at the documents on the table, and then she looked up at me, and her eyes were full in a way that she was working very hard to keep contained. Her husband picked up his jacket from the back of the chair where he'd left it. He said they should go. He said this in the tone of someone who is declaring a tactical retreat while pretending it's a scheduled departure. My sister stood. She looked at me and started to say something and stopped. She looked at our mother and said she was sorry. It came out small. It didn't fix anything, but it was real, and I noted that. They left. The truck backed out of the driveway. And then it was just the two of us in the house and the light on the water outside the window that faces west. I made tea. My mother didn't say anything for a while, which is her way of processing things she hasn't finished understanding yet. I didn't fill the silence. I've learned over the years that her silences aren't empty. They're just slow. Eventually, she asked me how long I'd been planning this. I told her 2.5 years. She asked why I hadn't told her. I said, because I wanted her to have the experience of arriving somewhere that was already hers, without the anxiety of watching it being built, without feeling like she owed anything, without having time to talk herself out of accepting it. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, in the way my mother says things that she means absolutely and without performance, that my father would have loved this place. I had to look at the window for a moment. She asked about the legal structure. She's not an unsophisticated woman. She'd looked at the documents. She asked what the reversionary clause meant in practice, what would happen when she was gone. I explained it clearly. The property was hers entirely and completely for her lifetime. She could change things about it, plant things, repaint things, invite people she chose to invite. Nobody could rent it without her written agreement. Nobody could leverage it. It was not a family asset in any legal sense that her son-in-law could access. Upon her death, it would come back to me, at which point I could make my own decisions about it. She nodded slowly. Then she said, and this is the part I've thought about many times since, that she wanted to make sure she understood something. She said, you built me something real with a door that locks, and you also made sure no one could take the key. I said yes. That was exactly it. She put her hand over mine on the table. She didn't say anything else for a while. Later that afternoon, I showed her the garden bed along the south wall. I told her I'd left it empty. She walked along it slowly, touching the soil, and she said she thought she might put in lavender on the eastern end and maybe some heritage tomatoes in the middle and a lilac on the corner, because she'd always felt wrong leaving the one in Barrie behind. I told her we'd go to the nursery in the morning. She stood at the edge of the garden bed and looked out at the lake, and the light was doing what lake light does in late September in Ontario, going gold and low and wide across the water, and she looked like someone who had been held tightly for a very long time and had just been allowed to put something down. I want to say something about my sister, because I've had time to think about it. She is not the person I'm angry at. She is someone who has spent 9 years being slowly convinced that the world is a ledger and that love is a line item. That's its own kind of loss, and I don't know how to fix it. I don't know if she knows how to fix it either. What I know is that I can't protect my mother from every version of that, but I can make sure that one specific door stays locked. There's a conversation I've had with a few people since all of this happened. People who asked whether I should have just kept the property in my name, whether putting it in my mother's name was a risk. And I've thought about that. But here's the thing. I didn't do this so I could own something. I did it so she could. There's a difference between building someone a gift and building yourself an asset that someone else happens to live in. I wanted her to have the thing itself, not just the use of it. The legal structure was just the way I made sure the gift stayed a gift. If you're ever in a position where you're trying to protect a family member's home or their security, please talk to a real estate lawyer before you do anything else. Ontario has specific instruments, life estates, reversionary clauses, trust structures that most people don't know exist until they need them, and it's too late. My lawyer cost me money. She saved me more than that. I drove back to Ottawa on Sunday evening. Before I left, I sat with my mother on the covered porch for a while. The lake was very still. There was a loon somewhere out of sight, calling once and then going quiet. She said she hadn't slept that well in years. I drove home thinking about my father, about the fact that he never got to retire, never got to stand somewhere and look at water and not have to be anywhere else. I thought about how much of what I'd done was for my mother and how much of it was for him, by way of her. I don't think those two things are separate. A locked door isn't a barrier. It's just a way of saying, what's inside here belongs to someone who deserves to keep it. My mother has already ordered the lavender.